The night train. Miami, Florida.
Greetings, everyone. You're listening to a special edition of All Aboard the Night Train with your host, Frank George. Today is March 27th, 2018. It is Tuesday here in the United States of America. And in South Africa, the situation is dire for white South Africans as black communists take to the streets to take lands and property away from white South Africans because the Constitution is going to be amended in August, it is said, to legally allow the expropriation of property without compensation. In other words, property can be taken away without giving anyone any money for it, and this is where that country is headed. And as a consequence, today, as in a few days before today, there has been extreme violence as blacks go out to claim property and engage in violence. All of this targets the white population of South Africa. We have managed to locate in South Africa to do this interview Mr. Cuan Elgin, the author of Bulala, a book about a true story of South Africa. Here is our interview from South Africa. Today is March 27, 2018. We're speaking with Mr. Cuan Elgin, who is in South Africa at the moment, seeing that there are riots happening right in the very neighborhood that he lives in. South Africa, of course, has had a very bad situation with the takeover of its formerly white government by black communists, the African National Congress, and now the Economic Freedom Fighters, who are extremists and led by Mr. Julia Malema, are demanding the expropriation of lands and property of the whites in South Africa. The Constitution has yet to be amended to include expropriation without payment. As I understand it, at the moment, expropriation is possible, but payment is required. That may not entirely be the truth. Mr. Cuan Elgin, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thank you, Frank. I'm fine at the moment. Thank you very much for asking, and it's good to be on your show.
Was my statement correct? Currently, the Constitution has not been amended, but it does include expropriation with payment. It will be amended to make it so that expropriation or the taking of lands and property will not have to be paid for. Is this correct, sir?
That's quite right. Like most countries, the current Constitution of South Africa, which is apparently the most liberal in the world, not necessarily in a good way, but it does provide under Section 25 for expropriation. In most countries, if a freeway, for instance, or a railway line needs to be put through some area and the landowners are not too happy about it, the government does have some muscle in the national interest, so to speak, but that would involve, obviously, fair compensation. But as you rightly say, the ANC government now wants to change the Constitution. They need an overwhelming majority in Parliament to do that, which it appears that they have got it. The Constitutional Court has been requested to rule on this. They have until August. And if they rule that it can go ahead, then exactly as you say, expropriation without compensation, and the wording is critical, expropriation of property. So in South Africa, property under law would be defined as anything from your ashtray to your car to your intellectual property to your home to your farm. It can be anything that you own. And that is the danger here, is that if this goes through, and it looks very likely, then the target is clearly the number one target will be the white farms, white-owned farmland. Now, South Africa is a largely arid country, and only about 15% of it is arable in the normal sense without irrigation. So the most productive, shall we say, farmland is generally owned by white commercial farmers, although there's a lot of very good farmland in the former black homelands, which is being underutilized, and the government itself, the ANC, owns millions of acres of state land, but they're ignoring all that and they're focusing on white-owned land. It's a political thing. It's got nothing to do with food security. In fact, it will destroy food security. We only have about 30,000 commercial farmers in this country. I know America's got something like 2 million, and proportionately we've got a lot less, and they're feeding 55 million people. So every farmer is feeding, with 2,000 people. So it goes, and the danger is that this land will be expropriated and destroy our agricultural economy in the same way that it happened in Zimbabwe. And the ANC appears to be following the Zimbabwe model. They seem to have learned absolutely nothing from it. And in fact, Robert Mugabe, the dictator who was deposed recently or stepped down in Zimbabwe, he was given standing ovations by the ANC every time he addressed our parliament, which was fairly often. So he's considered a hero by the ANC. And as you rightly say, the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which are a straight-up Marxist party, they're supposedly an opposition party, the second largest opposition party, but they're nothing of the sort, really. They're just a more radical version of the ANC. And it would appear that the new president of the ANC only took over about a month or so ago from Zuma, who essentially looted the country. A lot of people were hoping for better days. I'm a little bit more cynical, but he announced in his first major address to the nation, in the State of the Nation address, much like your State of the Union address, that it had been unanimously agreed. I'm assuming he's talking about ANC unanimously agreeing it, not the people who own the land, but that the land would, the property specifically, would be expropriated without compensation. And they were now just passing this motion on, which went through Parliament like a dose of salts, 240 odd votes to about 80 against, which is more than enough to guarantee that the Constitution will be changed. But it's now up to the Constitutional Court to actually make the ruling, and they've got until the end of August. So in the interim, a lot of land invasions are happening. Obviously, the lowest common denominators in the country believe that this is going to go through, so they're getting ahead of the game and marking out plots all over people's farms, on public open ground, on private property, and in our very town at the moment, which is quite an upmarket touristy town. It's Hermanus on the east coast, about an hour and a half from Cape Town, hour and a half's drive. It's the whale-watching capital of the world, in fact, quite a famous town. And it's a smallish town, probably in our terms, a smallish little city, 100,000 people, and of which 50,000 are blacks. And they moved in pretty recently, 10 years ago. There was not a black to be seen here, but they've been squatting over the last 10 years, coming in the busloads. And unfortunately, the Liberal Council has allowed the squatting. Now these people are essentially bursting out of their little township and marking out plots all over the place. And there's been a lot of rioting, a lot of destruction. They burnt down the library, they burnt down the satellite police station, the school, one of the schools. All the other schools are closed at the moment. Most of the shops are closed. People are hunkering down. It's very tense. And the police, to their credit, the local police, have tried to keep some kind of order, but they've been shooting a lot of birdshot or at least rubber bullets. We're not sure exactly what ammunition they're using, not sharp arrows so far. But there's been 3 deaths, but apparently those deaths, and this is the strange thing about South Africa, is that there's a differentiation here between black folk and coloured folk. And the coloured folk make that distinction. The coloured folk are essentially mixed race, and they speak Afrikaans, which is what a lot of the whites speak. They don't speak an African language, and they sort of gravitate socially towards the whites and culturally, and they are as afraid of these land grabs as the whites are, because they often get targeted. And at the 3 deaths that we've had so far in the town over the last week apparently are from coloured folk shooting black folk who have been invading their land. So it's a real mess, and it's the latest update we've had is that Julius Malema himself, this Marxist thug who is the leader of the EFF and who called for this motion to go to Parliament, which it did very easily, he's apparently coming to address the rioters here this afternoon. We'll see if it happens, whether he's coming to encourage them or to ask them to cool it, we're not sure. But this is the support we've had. And we can see quite clearly from our top story, from our bedroom window, the columns of smoke and the area that is most affected. It's only probably half a mile away at the most, and that's been a riot zone or a war zone for the last 5 days. It quietens down and then it flares up again. So everybody's pretty tense, and as I say, people are hunkering down. We're on a reasonably secure state. So far we haven't had any real problems, but people are avoiding going out. I went out to the shops just a few hours ago for the first time in a couple of days, and most of the shops are closed. And the shops I was in was busy closing up, and said they'd just been tipped off that busloads more of rioters are being brought in from outlying areas. This is what the ANC does, or the EFF. As I say, I don't believe for a moment the EFF is a genuine opposition party. I believe they're just a radical arm of the ANC, and they kind of the attack dogs, and the ANC likes to be more moderate, and the EFF more radical, but their agenda is exactly the same. They've all agreed, and unanimously, as it was said, that this is going to happen, and it's been happening for years, on and off sporadically, but now there's been a real impetus to it with the announcement by the President that this expropriation is going to take place. So, as I say, people seem to have jumped the gun, and they're marking themselves out plots, and other people are resisting it. The police are trying to keep order to their credit, but it's not looking very happy now.
Okay, Cuan, is it only in your area where you live that the rioting is taking place, or is it occurring in other places too?
It's all over the country, Frank. Up country, around Johannesburg, that province is called Gauteng. Our province is the Western Cape, which is as far away as you can get from Joburg, and it's happening all over the country. As I say, the police, to their credit, generally manage to drive these people off, and there's an outfit. It's real South African stuff. It's called the Red Ants. It's Red Ant Security, and they employ, strangely, blacks in large numbers in red overalls. It's rather like the EFF, but the red overalls, they've got protective helmets on, and they've got crowbars, and when these shacks get put up on these private property or public open space, the police often call in at some expense to the local council or municipality. They call in the Red Ants, and they come and break down these structures and carry off the building material. So this is ongoing. It's almost like a game. But people get hurt, and people get shot, and people want to leave the country. There's another wave of South African whites who will now very likely leave. Every time something like this flares up, more and more leave. And at the moment, the farmers, and there's very few commercial farmers in South Africa, only about 30,000. A lot of them are likely to be accepted into Australia. Australia has made it very clear that they believe that this is racist suppression by the ANC, and that these farmers are under siege and they're being murdered at a rate 10 times higher than normal citizens, and basically a genocide of our white farmers. And Australia says they're going to fast-track visa applications. So there's a very good chance that we'll lose our very small pool of commercial farmers to countries who value them more highly. And the Zimbabwe situation looms, because that's exactly what happened there, and the ANC seems to be following exactly the same pattern. Robert Mugabe, the Zimbabwe dictator who recently was deposed or stepped down, he was always given standing ovations by the ANC when he came to address our parliament here. So he's considered a hero by the ANC, and yet he destroyed his country. The agricultural economy completely collapsed after he drove the white farmers off their land and portioned it out to his voters. And it looks like the ANC are going to go the same route. They don't seem to have learned anything from the disaster of Zimbabwe. And this is the strange thing. South Africa, as I say, is a fascinating country, not always in a good way. But at the moment, there's millions of Zimbabweans in South Africa who were starving in Zimbabwe, and they came to South Africa looking for jobs, and a lot of them were employed on farms by white farmers. And at the moment, some of the Zimbabwean shops and businesses which have opened up even in our town have been attacked by these black rioters who are not really locals. They're Xhosa, Mandela's tribe. We've been busted, most of them. And they've been attacking these shops. We get a lot of xenophobia in South Africa, against other blacks. And the weirdest thing is that the white liberals are taking the Zimbabweans into their homes to protect them at the moment from other blacks who are attacking them. So it's a real mess. The local community hall at the moment is jam-packed with Zimbabweans and Somalians and Zambians and sort of upcountry across our border, north border blacks who were living in the area, a lot of them illegally. And the South African blacks, so mainly Xhosas, the Mandela's tribe who are from the Eastern Cape, and they've been bussed into the Western Cape, where we are, to cause all this trouble and try and swing the vote the ANC's way and so on. And these people are being attacked, these so-called foreigners, also black Africans. But the target is the white property, the white-owned property. We're down to 8% of the population now, the whites of South Africa. We were 20% at one stage, but our numbers have shrunk as people have left, and the black folks' numbers have exploded. So we're down to 8% now, and it's looking rather bleak. The rule of law goes down the toilet when property rights are not secure, as anyone in a civilized country knows. And the ANC's now made it very clear that our property rights are going to be done away with. So the confidence levels have got to zero, and it's a great shame because this country has incredible potential and a pool of very precious farmers. Just to put it in perspective, Frank, we only have about 30,000 commercial farmers in this country, virtually all of whom are white, and the blacks tend to be subsistence farmers, so they can't leave the cities. And we have some big cities, many millions of people, which need to be fed, and the subsistence black farmers just don't have the wherewithal and the expertise to do that. So it's over to the white farmers, the commercial farmers, who are very successful in farming what is essentially an arid country. They're very skillful. But roughly 10% of them apparently have been murdered in the last 20-odd years since the ANC got in. 10% of our commercial farmers on their farms. There's a big outcry now. We've been shouting about it for decades, but nobody took any notice until the announcement was made for the expropriation of land or property, and suddenly the actual murder of the farmers has come to people's attention as well. But to put it in perspective, you've got roughly 2 million commercial farmers in America. I've been looking at some statistics. If 10% of them had been murdered in 20 years, that would be 200,000. It's the same proportion, and I would imagine that, well, I know, that in a civilized country like the United States, if 200,000 farmers were brutally murdered on their farms in 20 years, that would be called a genocide aimed at a specific group, in this case a specific ethnic group. Yet here, the government absolutely denies it, and they fudge the figures, and they won't specify whether the race or the occupation, etc. But it's well known that a South African farmer has got 10 times higher chance of being murdered than the normal citizen, and we're already one of the murder capitals of the world. So I'm talking about a South African citizen, and something like about a 50 times higher chance of being murdered than your average citizen in the world. This is a farmer who, expects to have a peaceful existence in a rural area. But they're under siege, and they have been for decades, and the ANC banned, it's almost 15 years ago now, the second president, the one after Mandela and Mbeki, did away with what we call the commando units, which were voluntary rural protection units, generally trained soldiers who'd done their time in the military and then volunteered as part-time security in the rural areas, and they also protected the borders of the country for duties. That was done away with by Mbeki, the president after Mandela, because they didn't want, didn't like the thought of armed whites running around. So they did away with it, and the farm murders went through the roof because the farmers are now completely exposed. They're in isolated areas, very difficult to protect themselves. It's very difficult to get a firearm permit in this country now, extremely difficult. And so they're essentially unarmed. Most civilians are unarmed.
Hello, Elgin. We lost you, but we do have everything. And where you left off, you said that the civilians were now completely unarmed and had no means of defending themselves. Is that correct?
Well, that's largely the situation. It's extremely difficult to get a firearm permit in South Africa. You've got to jump through hoops, and it's quite expensive and takes a long time, and it's it's extremely difficult. So if a farmer is armed, he'll be very likely armed, perhaps with a shotgun for vermin, maybe a handgun, things like that. But most of them are not armed, and your average civilian is definitely not armed. Yet there's millions of illegal guns in the country, which the ANC brought in during their liberation struggle. They smuggled in millions of AK-47s mostly, and very often assisted by European countries like Sweden, Denmark, Holland. They helped the ANC. They donated money to them. They had overland trucks coming in with tourists on them, but there were hidden compartments on these trucks bringing in arms. This went on for decades. So the country is swimming in illegal arms, which obviously in the hands of criminals and not in the hands of the law-abiding. And so it's a dire situation. The farmers are very vulnerable. Your average citizen is very vulnerable, and the government blatantly denies that there's a problem in terms of the murder of our farmers, which, as I mentioned earlier, is reaching the proportions of a genocide. They're a very small, specific group of Boers, as we call them, Boer. It's essentially a Dutch word for farmer. Afrikaans is largely based on Dutch and German. So Boers. And the Boers were considered a race once. There was the Anglo-Boer War. Two of them, in fact, when Britain set its eyes on stealing the gold mines, the diamond mines of South Africa 115 years ago. And they attacked the two Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And after 2.5 years of ferocious war, which taught the British quite a lesson, the first 6 months they got absolutely thrashed. But then the weight of arms, 500,000 British against 50,000 Boers, the weight of arms told, and they eventually took the country. And so we've been colonized too by the British. And they only really handed the country back in the early 1960s to the Boers, who are these days more commonly called the Afrikaners, which essentially means man of Africa, and they speak Afrikaans, which is quite unique to this country, and is basically Dutch, which has evolved over 350 years in South Africa into a local language. And these Boers, or Afrikaners, as they're commonly called, we're down. I consider myself an African. I'm born here. I'm fourth generation. My children are fourth generation, and grandchildren. But my wife's family are 11th generation. They came out in 1688. French Huguenot, or Huguenots, as you'd say, I think, religious refugees, and the Dutch welcomed them, and they started the wine growing industry here. So farming in South Africa has been going on under whites as long as farming has been going on in America under whites. Yet no one in America would ever consider it a responsible thing to do, is to expropriate farmers' land based on some historical perception that they took the land without permission, which is completely wrong. There were no black people in what is now called the Cape, which is the largest part of South Africa, where I am. That has been under white farming for 360 years. There were no blacks here. They were still migrating down from Central, East, and West Africa, and they eventually clashed with the whites 130 years after the whites had established themselves in the Cape and then started to move inland. And only then did they come across the first blacks. So for the blacks, the government, black majority government, the ANC, to say that the whites stole the land is an absolute lie. Yet this has been perpetuated for decades, and the liberal media of the world loves to say the same thing, that the whites stole the land, and so this is, just retribution. Nothing could be further from the truth. And when the whites did arrive in South Africa in the 1650s and settled for permanently, there was absolutely nothing here. There were a few little scattered clans of what were called Hottentots in those days, and Bushmen, which were Stone Age men, here and there, sort of like the Aborigines in Australia, but they certainly weren't spread all over the country. They were just in little isolated pockets. But they're not Bantu, which is the black African, the black sub-Saharan African. They're very different. And the Bushmen and Hottentots have essentially gone extinct, or they've been assimilated into the great so-called coloured population, which is the mixed race population, who don't see themselves as black at all. That's the strange thing about South Africa. You've got blacks and coloured, and they identify themselves separately. The blacks speak an African language, a Bantu language it's called. They're sub-Saharan Negroes, essentially, or Negroid, and then the coloured folk are identify much more with the whites in terms of their culture and their language. They speak Afrikaans. They don't speak a black language as such. So at the moment, the rioting going on here, the 3 fatalities we've had in our town over the last couple of days, I believe, from what I hear, are actually black rioters who were shot by colored people who were trying to protect their property.
Wow. I want to address something. You are the author of a book. That book is called. I always forget if it's.
My book is.
Yes.
Bulala. It's Bulala. Bulla. It actually, Frank, was published in the United States. The first edition. It's easily available there. I couldn't get it published in South Africa. It's been going for about 9 years now. It's rated 5 stars on Amazon. It's a bestseller in South African terms. But the first edition had to be published in the United States because it was too so-called politically incorrect, because it tells the truth about South Africa. So I published it in the United States, and if you don't mind, I could give a link for your listeners.
Yes. Look, even I was trying to get a copy of your book, and on Amazon it's no longer available. They have it there, but they don't have availability. It is not available as a digital download either. Give us what information so we can gain access to it, please.
Okay. It's sold out on Amazon at the moment, but it's very easily obtainable in the United States. Any bookstore can, in fact, order it. Or one can go direct to the publisher there, and his email address is straightforward. It's STM, S Sierra, T for Tango, M, in Formali, let's say, STM, which is Sacred Truth Ministries, or the website is Sacred Truth, but it's STM at Mounet, MOUNET.com, or Moonet, like mountain, STM at Mounet, MOUNET.com. Or one could just Google Sacred Truth Publishing or Sacred Truth Ministries. They're in Tennessee, and they have a website called Christogenia. They're a Christian-oriented, conservative publisher with many thousands of titles on their catalogs. But Bulala, Bullala, which is a Zulu word for kill. I'll tell you the origin of it if I have a few seconds. But it's my name, Cuan, C-U-A-N, like Cuban without the B. If I believe you from Cuba.
Yes.
Cuan, C-U-A-N, Elgin, E-L-G-I-N, like the town in Scotland, Cuan Elgin, and Bulala, B-U-L-A-L-A. If you Google it, you will find it quite easily. As I say, Amazon is unfortunately out of stock at the moment. It's rated 5 stars on Amazon, so it's doing well. In South African terms, it's a bestseller, but we had to have a second edition printed here. Once it was in the public domain, then we took the chance and published it here, and it's done extremely well. But in America, it's selling very well. But go directly to the publisher; he'll send you one by mail. And if I'm not mistaken, the price is $18.38, which is exactly the same as the date of the miraculous Battle of Blood River, which you will read about in the book. It's part of our history, and the book covers our entire history in a very readable novel format. It's less than 400 pages. It's got a couple of maps and a lot of footnotes, but it's historically accurate, and it's the other side of the story, which you've never heard about South Africa. And I've written it in novel form to make it very readable and a nice, exciting ride through our history, but it's factually based and factually correct, historically accurate. So by the end of it, you will have South Africa's history in a nutshell in your mind. And,
that's wonderful. Cuan, before I forget, I do want to ask you, I know that you're going through some horrible times right now, because from your window you can see smoke and you can see what rioting is taking place and such. Have the international media arrived to cover the event at all, to your knowledge?
Here and there, Frank, but what is very encouraging in a kind of an unfortunate way is that suddenly South Africa is back in the news. You know, CNN and all the mainstream media, they covered the whole transition to the communist ANC takeover with great relish, and then they disappeared for 20 years. Now they're back because there's rioting. The whites are under threat, so they're thinking this is going to be some good footage here. So unfortunately, so they're back, and I think you're going to see a lot more of South Africa on television now, on the mainstream media and on broadcast. Unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons, but at least the eyes of the world have now turned back, and they're focusing again on South Africa. and greatly encouraging for us as an 8% minority here, the whites, is that there's outrage in many countries about this announcement of expropriation without compensation, which seems to be specifically targeted at white property, white-owned land, white property in general. And it's triggered a land grab all over the country, which the police, to their credit, are trying to hold back.
So you have personally seen camera units out there from overseas? You personally have seen this?
Yes, I've seen it on Australian television. There's a lot of stuff on the social media, on YouTube, etc. Australia has really picked up on it, and this is very encouraging because they've offered to fast-track visas, which is a shame, but as I say, encouraging that they actually have some sympathy for us because they were not that friendly to us during the whole Mandela takeover, the euphoria of the takeover 24 years ago. But now they seem to have come to their senses, and they're offering to fast-track visas for South African farmers to get there because they realize they really are under dire threat, and the South African government is blatantly denying that there's any threat, and which is a blatant lie.
Have you seen any United States media? Have you seen any United States media?
Unfortunately, not a lot.
Oh,
very little.
That is
very
sad.
I know one or two programs. I think there's been a couple of reports, but it's not big news there yet, as far as I know. But I'm sure it will become so. But the English media have picked it up. UK. The Belgian, some French, strangely enough, Sweden, which was very supportive of the ANC, smuggled arms in for them, gave them money, etc. They are now realizing what a terrible thing they did. And they've, of course, got their own problems now because they've got an influx of third worlders logged from Africa who are bringing all the problems we have to them. So we're very sorry that's happening. We hope Europe stays Europe. But I'm hoping that the American media will pick up on it very soon. We're hoping Mr. Trump personally will get involved. He had a huge amount of support in South Africa before the elections, and we're hoping that he keeps an eye on things here and that he talks sternly to this government and says to them that it's unacceptable in civilized countries and international law to take away people's property without compensation, and that the fact that the ANC was promoting this whole idea is unacceptable. We really, really hope President Trump comes to our aid in that way. There has to be rule of law. Once property rights are trampled on, then everything falls apart. And with this, Africa cannot afford to lose South Africa. We are the anchor. We're the biggest food producer on the continent. We are the powerhouse of the continent economically and in every other way. And unfortunately, that's been weakened considerably over the last 2 decades with the ANC in power, almost 25 years now. And it looks as though they're about to destroy the country. It's looking that dire. And for the whites, the 8% white minority, things are looking rather bleak. So we really do hope that President Trump does get involved.
Okay, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question about an attempted secession. The Khoi King, King Cornelius III, has declared a secession. That was on YouTube. I saw it. Are your people, are the white South Africans even aware of this attempt?
Yes, they are. There's a party, a political party, very small, unfortunately, called the Cape Party, which is wanting Cape independence. As I mentioned, the Cape is the biggest sort of single geographical area of South Africa, probably half the country, and that's traditionally always been populated by, as you mentioned, the Khoi, who used to be called Hottentots. They were the Aboriginal inhabitants, in a sense. They're not black African. They're very different. And their king has a very symbolic gesture he's made, really, to declare secession. Nobody's taken much notice of him, except the whites who are in the Cape, who say, well, these are the original inhabitants, along with us. We've been here 360 years. There were no blacks in the Cape when we arrived, and we never saw a black for the next 130 years until we ran into them 1,000 miles from Cape Town. They'd stopped migrating down. They'd stopped what is called the Great Fish River in the Eastern Cape, which is on the edge of the main Cape. And they stopped there as a geographical barrier. The climate changes to kind of Mediterranean with cool, wet winters, and there's very little in terms of pasture. It's scrub. So they were cattle herders, and they just stopped naturally in that area of the Great Sluice River. So they've never owned land in the Cape until very recently, and to claim it as their own and say that the whites stole it is a blatant lie. So I think there's some support amongst the whites for the declaration by the Khoi king, but it's more of a symbolic gesture. You know, the ANC controlled everything. They had the army, the police, the security forces.
Yes.
So any declaration of secession would be quite a dangerous move, although I know would have a lot of support in the Cape. We're sick and tired of paying taxes to the central government and never seeing the benefits. The ANC just swallows it up. As you probably know, Zuma, the previous president, who only stepped down a month or so ago, he absolutely looted the country. And the ANC gave him huge banquets, thanking him on taxpayers' money, thanking him for his contribution to the country. You know, they're scoundrels, they always have been, sorry to say, and I wish it was different. But they from the start, they've been a totally corrupt government, and they're just getting worse. And the new president, which many people had hopes for, he announced virtually straight away that they can expropriate private property without compensation. And it's very clear that they're talking about white property.
That is astounding. I want to very briefly cover how the white South Africans came into the situation that they're in. To my understanding, this is a white-founded country, started by whites, and there were no blacks in government. They came along later, and there was what was called apartheid, which is what we used to have in the United States as separate but equal, I suspect. And to my understanding, the white South Africans were very kind to the blacks in terms of providing hospitals, schools, even housing and such. And their demand was one for inclusion. The world did not approve of apartheid. You had Nelson Mandela, who was actually a communist thug, and wound up in prison, but it was a very nice setting for him. He even had a butler, to my understanding. We had Senator Edward Kennedy from the United States, who is the man that I say never died soon enough, showed up to protest the incarceration of Nelson Mandela. Apartheid ended, to my understanding, because of pressure from other countries of the world and embargoes that took place. And some kind of power brokering and agreements were made where blacks would be included in the white South African government. This would be the African National Congress, who were black communists. I think most people didn't know that at the time. And that ended white rule over a country that was founded by whites. Am I correct here? And please correct me where I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right, Frank. The first white immigrants were 360-odd years ago, and there were no blacks anywhere within 1,000 miles of where they settled. They then started farming very successfully as long ago as the white settlers started farming in America. And in fact, New York and Cape Town was founded a year before New York, which of course was originally New Amsterdam, by the same people, the Dutch. So we have very similar histories in that way, but to suggest now that the whites here are settlers and you can take away their farms because they invaded the place would be like saying that to the American people, the American farmers, that you're settlers and your land needs to be taken away because you're colonialists. It's absolute rubbish. The only colonialists in South Africa were the British, and they subjugated us as Afrikaners and Boers and the original settlers. We were subjugated by the British. They colonized us in a much the same way that America fought a war of independence, so did we, too, in fact, from Britain. So many parallels. But the ANC they are, as you say, communist. That was kept under wraps because they kept espousing democracy knowing that the West would support them. This is going back 40 years or so. If there was any mention of communism, they wouldn't have had the support of the West. So they kept it under wraps. Mandela was a communist. He even wrote a thesis called How to Be a Good Communist while he was in jail. And as you rightly say, he was well treated. He, in fact, not just had a butler, he had a swimming pool. He had a cottage in the grounds of the prison, etc. This is for the latter part of his incarceration. Initially, he was on Robben Island, where he was never ill-treated. It was a holiday camp, but he was captured in my book, Bulala, which I'm hoping your listeners would get hold of there. It describes what him and his cohorts were captured with. Hundreds of thousands of hand grenades and limpet mines and explosives in any other African country where they would have been put up against a wall and shot. And in fact, in any other Western country, they would have been hung because it was high treason. It was attempted an armed overthrow to start a race war, etc. But Mandela was built up by the liberal Western media into some kind of demigod and this grandfatherly, cheerful fellow. But in fact, he was a hardcore communist, and it was only announced after he died, which wasn't too long ago, a couple of years back, that he was in fact a communist. But we all knew that. South Africans knew that. But the rest of the world didn't seem to care or didn't know. And, of course, his party won the first democratic election, when I say democratic, including everybody, even those people who really had no claim to be South African. We've got millions and millions of black Africans from north of us who've just moved into the country and swamped the whites. We're down to 8% now. We really have been politically euthanized, but it was all jolly stuff in 94, this great election. Everybody thought this Rainbow Nation, as it's called, would become this wonderful example of multicultural nirvana. But in fact, it's been a bit of a hellhole for the whites ever since, because the rule of law has fallen away. The murder capital of the world, or very close to it, the rape capital of the world, and so it goes on, one of the corruption capitals of the world. This was in a country founded by Christians, very conservative Protestant Christians, and it was a very God-fearing country, but Bible-based morality, etc. Apartheid lasted 40 years. People don't often realize that. And in fact, slavery, which is going back now, I know in America there's people still wanting reparations, but slavery in South Africa was abolished 30 years before it was abolished in the United States by the whites. And in fact, no South African was ever enslaved. No black South African was ever enslaved. It was against the law from the start. There were slaves brought in by the Dutch East India Company from the east. They were mainly political prisoners and so on, and by the Portuguese from East and West Africa. But no South African has ever been enslaved. And then you mentioned in America you had segregation. Well, we had the same, and it finished in South Africa about 20 years after it did in America. It finished in the late 80s, and that was abolished by the whites, long before the ANC came in. And then Mandela was released about 1990. The elections, which the ANC won hands down, were in 94. So, you know, it's been about 30 years since segregation was abolished. It was known as separate development here. Apartheid, you know, gave it a bad name. That was kind of a horrible name for it. But it was separate development, and side-by-side, parallel development in a sense that the nationalist government, the white nationalist government, which was only in power for 40 years, and they never really had a majority even amongst the whites. There was lots of gerrymandering, there was always a strong opposition, but they managed to get it right, and they instituted this policy of separate development. And what they did is they tried to give independent homelands, and we're not talking about the reservations, these are province-sized homelands, which were absolute mineral treasure boxes and the best agricultural land in many cases in the country to each tribe. There's nine tribes in South Africa if you don't include the white tribe or the Afrikaner, but there's 9 black tribes, and each one was given a massive homeland with everything they needed. Full infrastructure was put in: roads, dams, airports, schools, hospitals, universities, you name it, at the white taxpayers' expense, bearing in mind there were never more than a couple of million white taxpayers, as opposed to tens of millions of blacks not paying tax. But all this was done for them. And that was this master plan that the white nationalist government had, that they would retain an area of South Africa for a white homeland as such one day. That was the long-term plan. But the rest of the world, you know, it's the 20th century, they wouldn't accept that kind of racially based or tribally based outcome, and they insisted on a fully democratic election. Everybody gets to vote, universal franchise, which essentially meant an absolute whitewash, blackwash, to the way you want to put it, where the ANC would win hands down. They had the support of the Western world, all the media, all the liberal media, and Mandela was punted as some kind of, you know, democratic demigod, which he certainly wasn't. He was a communist. And it's just got worse from there. Unfortunately, the ANC are punting themselves as sort of moderate, and the EFF, the so-called opposition, are the radicals. But in fact, their agendas are exactly the same, and their policies are exactly the same. So it's really a fake opposition. There is another opposition party called the Democratic Alliance, the DA, which was the party that most of the liberal whites supported, and but they've never accumulated more than 20% of the vote, so they're really neither here nor there. the whites have been politically euthanized. We are 8% of the population now.
I would like to ask you. I know that
suddenly
you're 8% of the population, which is horrific. But what are you in terms of government, and what representation you have? What is the percentage of whites there?
Virtually none. The new cabinet, there's never been more than one or two whites in the ANC's cabinet anyway, which is a couple of dozen ministers, that went from 8 or 9 ministers under the old white nationalist government to around 30 under the ANC, lots of nice, high-paying jobs. And there's never been more than one or two whites in it, and they're communists. There's never been a captain of industry, a genuine entrepreneur, white, who's been taken into the cabinet for his expertise. They've only brought in the odd white communist. And that's the situation today. I think there's 2 in the entire cabinet. They're both communists. So we are politically euthanized as capitalist, Western-oriented Christian people.
I have.
And the old lie, which keeps being propagated, is about who owns the land. You know, the ANC will sprout figures from 1913. Those are 105-year-old figures.
Yes.
You know, the country has changed dramatically in the last century, and the whites now own what they should own. You know, in America, for instance, 1% of the population own 40% of the land. Mm-hmm. They're farmers. Farmers own big tracts of land. But to put it in such simplistic terms in South Africa that the whites own a higher proportion, they're only 8% of the population, therefore they should only own 8% of the land, it's absolute garbage. If virtually all the commercial farmers are white, which they are, then of course they're going to own a much higher percentage of land than 8%. So the figures that are being punted, I even see them in National Geographic. Those are 100-year-old figures, but they keep punting them because it seems to me that the Western globalists want what's happening now. They want the whites to be completely subjugated or kicked out.
Okay, I have one final question for you before we end our interview, and I'm very grateful for what time you have spent with us. Your liberal whites, you mentioned liberal whites there in South Africa. How are they reacting to the news of expropriation without payment of any kind? And is there any inkling as how to they are reacting to the possibilities or attempts for secession? How are those folks reacting to the current situation?
Well, Frank, shock and horror. I don't have to tell you that liberals tend to be very gullible all over the world, and they really somehow imagine that a black majority government would be fair once elected, and those who objected so violently, the ANC, to being discriminated against on the grounds of their race, as they called it, would be fair once they got in. Well, the exact opposite has happened, and there's over 100 anti-white laws that the ANC has instituted, far more than there ever were under apartheid or separate development by the white nationalists, far more. The ANC has instituted over 100 anti-white labor laws. The whites are basically excluded from the job market. So it's kind of a nasty shock, the reality of race in Africa, to the liberals who really should have known better. You know, they're generally educated people, but they have this what they call unicorns and rainbows attitude to race relations, and they just are in absolute shock at the moment. They are paralyzed with shock that they, who supported the ANC, a lot of them, who supported this takeover of South Africa by communists or globalists or whatever you want to call them, they are now in great danger of losing their property. We did warn them. When I say we, the more conservative or moderate people said, listen, this is not going to go well. Communists are not exactly in favor of private property and so on. And they said, no, with the world watching, they'll never do it. The ANC, they'll go along with the Western orientation. They haven't. They've done exactly as we predicted. They're the more conservative whites, and it's now full steam ahead, and they've announced in Parliament, as you well know, and they want to change the Constitution. So shock and horror and disbelief is the reaction of the Liberals, yes.
Well, I hope they will all pull together. I want to thank you for this interview. It has been very inclusive. You've shared so much information with us. And if you would please, before we say goodbye, would you once again give us the title of your book and where people can purchase it? This is very important.
Thank you, Frank. It's called Bulala, Bullala, and it's a Zulu word for kill. which is it was the words used by a Zulu king in murdering white. He told his bodyguards to murder white emissaries after they'd signed the land deal, or the treacherous. So it's Bulala, B-U-L-A-L-A, and my name is Cuan, C-U-A-N, like Cuban without the B, C-U-A-N, Elgin, E-L-G-I-N, and the best place to get hold of it in the United States, the book, is to email STM, Sacred Truth Ministries, or Sacred Truth Publishing, STM at Maunet, M-O-U-N-E-T.com, STM at Maunet.com, or look them up on Google, Sacred Truth, and they're in Tennessee, and they published the first edition because we couldn't get it done in South Africa, too politically incorrect. But it's a great read. It's written in novel form, and I think you'll enjoy it. And by the end of it, you'll have a very clear idea of the entire history in South Africa. It's kind of like a mix between Shaka Zulu and Little House on the Prairie. That's what Eustace Mullen's comment. He read the book 3 times, and he loved it. I use his quote actually quite a lot. But it's a very entertaining story, and if you don't shed a few tears, I'd be surprised and have a few laughs. It's very entertaining, and STM at Maunet is the best place to get it. They'll mail you one.
Excellent, and I would ask you for some parting words, and then we'll say goodbye.
Well, Frank, it's been an absolute pleasure. I know I've rattled on at length here, but there's a lot happening around us. You know, my little town is at the moment a war zone. We unfortunately seem to have been borne the brunt of a lot of the land grabs in our province, but it's happening all over the country. It's people who are essentially jumping the gun before the Constitutional Court even decides if this is in fact acceptable, which of course it's not. Expropriation of property without compensation. We're going full-blown communism by the look of it. We knew it was coming. We knew this 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But the Western world were taken up in the euphoria of the straight democratic election in South Africa, which happened 25 years ago. The ANC are now showing their true colors, unfortunately. So we're asking the Western world to turn their cameras this way once again, which they did during the days of the handover to the ANC, and let them see now the results of this takeover. And we're looking for support from countries like America, Australia, the United Kingdom, and those European countries which supported the ANC to the hilt. We want them to see what's happening now and give us their at least moral support, and to make the world know that what is happening here is against all international law. It should not be allowed. It must not be allowed. And we want to thank you for the time you've given to us to have our say.
Thank you so much, Cuan. I will be keeping in touch with you here and there as things progress. I'm hoping that this measure for expropriation without compensation does not pass. I guess that's too much to hope for, but this will occur in August, so we want to keep our eyes on that, as well as the evolving situation in your country. Cuan Elgin, thank you so much, sir. Be safe. We pray for your safety and the safety of your family, and for your success as a people. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Frank. It's been a pleasure.
A pleasure, sir. Bye-bye.